Hello and welcome back to the Simplifiers podcast, where we take topics in business and in life and simplify them. And friends, I know I have been covering this topic in many shapes and forms this year, but boy, howdy, do I feel like this is the topic of 2020 and beyond. Change. Reimagining your life in a new lens, coming in and through and out of a pandemic takes epic feats. And I thought about one person that I wanted to invite back to the podcast that we could tackle it in a slightly different angle. Let's talk about death. Wait a second, what? Talking about death when we're talking about life? Oh yes, we are going there. My special guest today is Jess Weiner, and she is a cultural expert, speaker, educator, and consultant focusing on the intersection of business, social change, and inclusivity. She is the CEO of Talk to Jess, which she advises Fortune 500 companies to help them better reflect people in their media, marketing, advertising, and workforce. She's got a few clients under her belt like, Dove or Mattel and Barbie, Disney, Netflix, the White House Council for Women and Girls under the Obama administration, and so many more. Plus, she's also the adjunct professor at USC, one of the most creative people in business in the areas of diversity and education. That's what Fast Company said as well. And by the way, she's got a little podcast that's launching very, very soon called We're All Going to Die Anyways, featuring inspiring conversations about life, death, and, well, everything in between. So I'd like to welcome back to the Simplifiers podcast, Jess Weiner. Hey, Jess.
Hi. I'm getting goosebumps hearing that intro. Thank you.
You are welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. Talking about death, it seems like we're going to be Debbie Downer this whole conversation, but that's not the case, right?
No, not at all. I have been fascinated with looking at the urgency and the joy of living by just being present and aware to what is going to happen to all of us eventually, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we know that that's a given. We're all born, we're all going to die. In that way, we are completely equal. But that time and space in between is really what we're making of our lives. And so, as I'm growing and evolving as a person and in my work, this is a new area of conversation that I'm finding really lights me up. To talk about death actually gets people lit up for living.
Yeah. And it is such a perspective shift when you either have a loved one who is, ending to their final chapter, or even a loved pet. I mean, it's a huge journey to witness and walk alongside someone, hold their hand through it. Have you also been through something like that as well?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've had some pretty formidable losses in my life, both of physical nature, meaning losing, like you said, loved ones and animals. But I've also had loss of my identity, of friendships, of relationships. So, as I'm looking to talk about death, it's not only the material death of our bodies, it's the death of what we've become accustomed to, which, by the way, in this moment we're sitting in time, we are all grieving a loss of a world that will never go back to being exactly the same as it was before COVID-19. And so, we're all experiencing grief at this time. And so, I think this is a right time for us to talk about things.
And isn't it crazy? I mean, we spoke in middle of February 2020. And I'll put a link in the show notes, all links and resources we talk about in this episode, by the way. You can check them out at thesimplifierspodcast.com. So we talked in February about how to create social change and belonging in your work. And here we are a few months later, the whole world has changed, literally changed. And I should put a timestamp on this conversation. So we're recording this on May 22nd, 2020. And the reason I've been doing that lately, Jess, is because literally the world changes almost daily. And have you found also that in your own business and working with clients, like there's a process of dealing with the grief and trauma that comes from a change as profound as this, right?
Oh, absolutely. Not even just my clients, although that's definitely been impacting them because I work with a lot of companies who rely on retail stores,
right,
to sell their goods, right? So we're not going out and we're not engaging in those stores anymore. And what does that mean for the future of business for industries that work in that space, amongst many others? But I remember when we first all sort of realized the enormity of what was happening to us. I feel like we've all gone through those like many stages of grief.
Yeah.
We had denial, we had sort of reckoning or bargaining, and we have loss and we have sadness. And so I think when you talk about when we spoke in February, we were talking about the ability to create social change. And I think we went under the assumption that we were going to be in same rooms with people.
Yeah.
And that, and now we have to think about how are we going to make social change and connection like this through a screen,
Yeah.
even more so than we ever did before. And that changes the way we relate to each other, and it changes the way businesses relate to their clients.
So back to death, because I think that these two topics are actually very much interlinked. Back to that, you've had some profound conversations, I've heard, with guests that you are about to release on your podcast that truly have helped you to see behind the curtain in many people's lives and understand how do people face the loss that comes in death, and how does that actually help them live better? What have you heard so far?
I've heard some really incredible stories that once again remind me of the shared humanity that we have, Mary. And I think when we start to think about, loss and death are great equalizers for us. Everybody has at some point or another will go through a significant loss. So the guests that I've spoken to have either witnessed losing somebody in real time. They might have been in the room when somebody passed from cancer or a terminal illness, or they might have had a shocking death. The phone call that you get one day that all of a sudden somebody that you love and admire is gone. And I think we talk less about it's interesting. I had a guest who lost her father. I have one of the guests on my show. Her name is Alex Jackson, and her father, Maynard Jackson, was one of the most prominent first Black mayors of Atlanta, a southern city. And he had 3 terms there, super successful. The airport there is named after him, Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, right? So Alex had a very public passing of her father. And, everybody shared in that grief and everybody was mourning his loss. But she said something to me on the show that was like really, I've not stopped thinking about it. She said that even though, yes, she was profoundly sad that she lost her father, she realized that she could use grief to her advantage. She could focus on the incredible gifts that were given to her while he was alive.
Yeah.
She could spend her time and energy thinking about the lessons that she had from enjoying his life versus the sadness of reliving his death and his loss over and over again. And I guess what that lit up in me was the idea that we are all going to experience this in some way. We can't escape it. It is part of human nature and our human living. But what we choose to do with it, how we choose to frame it for ourselves, how we choose to use it to connect to each other, that we have in our power.
And, when I think about what's going on through the pandemic now and the stories that you hear are literally around the world, there is a lot of research that's coming out and stories about the fact that there's quite a few people who have lost people because of the virus or just simply because of natural causes that can't come together for a funeral or any sort of memorial service. And so that ability to have ritual to process the grief of saying goodbye to a loved one is not happening and it's being delayed. Are you hearing any sort of stories in that regard or seeing any similarities in how people are managing that grief and trauma?
So on We're All Gonna Die Anyway, we talk a lot about ritual, as you just mentioned. We talk a lot about what we need to do to move through a loss. And for those people who cannot mourn or grieve with their families, who cannot even hug each other if they are able to be in close proximity, there is another loss that happens if you're not able to have that ritual. And I have a very personal experience that, I haven't talked about a lot publicly, but I do talk about it a little bit on the show. I lost a really, a dear friend and my first love when I was 13 years old. It's partly what brought me on this journey of thinking about death and loss. And he had a very tragic passing, and he also belonged to a public family. His father was a politician as well. That's a similarity Alex Jackson and I share in a lot of ways. And I couldn't go to his funeral because it was closed to the public. And I remember being a young girl and not having the ritual of closure that needed to happen. And that haunted me and impacted me psychologically for a lot of my life. I mean, I've done a lot of work around that. And so I think when we're looking at whether you're burying somebody or whether you're mourning the loss of a business that might have had to close down or an employee that you have to let go of, they are all losses. And I think what I'm asking people to do during this time is not weigh or measure your loss against somebody else's, and don't weigh it against the headlines. Loss is loss, and the way it impacts you is really important. And the way you ritualize moving through that is deeply important in the grieving process.
Well, and think about it. Okay, so I'll admit I'm 42 also. I've had quite a few different identities over my own career, and how we put ritual to that as well, I think is really, really important. There's certain reasons why we hang on to certain pairs of jeans in our closet, because we're like, we're still that size and we're still that person, right? In our head, we want it to work. But the truth is that it's okay to let go of a past identity or past chapter or season of your life. And maybe there is something to having a ritual to honor it, to celebrate it, and to let it go. What do you think?
Oh, I certainly love that idea, because ritual is important in my life. I have certain rituals when I begin projects, or I try to manifest things, or I try to, bring things in. But one of the things you mentioned that I haven't done a lot of is the process of letting go and closing. And so if you think about it, and I think about your listeners right now, all of us who run small businesses, when we're trying to manifest more growth or a new client or a better team or any kind of business goal we have, we do journaling, we do vision boards, we join cohorts and have conversations when we're trying to make something. But what about when we're trying to release something? And I think that's the part, and especially for women, I have to be honest. I think for me, this conversation is so resonant with women, because we go through so many social, psychological, emotional changes in our life stages, and we don't have a platform to talk about it. I'm also in the middle passage of my life. I'm in my 40s. That is a significant life space. And we don't have a lot of communities to talk about whether your kids are going off to college, whether you've chosen not to have children and you're looking at the back half of your life with a different set of priorities, whether you've had to close a business, sell a business, get fired from a business. I mean, there are lots of things that happen that I think I'd love to normalize. And that's really why I wanted to do this podcast, because I felt like, for me, if you knew me, my friends always laugh, because for a long time I've said, when anything happens, well, we're all going to die anyway. And they're always like, oh my God, that's so morbid. But for me, it's actually a resetting piece. It brings me joy. It's like, oh, right. Half of the stuff I stress about is not as important as I make it. Exactly. So what is important? What do I value, and how do I live more fully in that space?
Yes, and I noticed as well on your website, you talk about living a good life. And I want to be very, very clear. A good life is not the same as being a good girl, right? Let's talk about that for a second.
Oh, yes. No, I'm using the phrase of the good life all the way back to Socrates, who talked about a life unexamined is not worth living.
Yeah.
And that's what I wanted to talk about was, are we defining, especially as women, but are we defining a good life on our terms? Or are we bending to what we think society wants, our parents want, our friends are doing? And, ironically, I used to have these conversations quite a bit with young women. That's how I started my career. I talked a lot with teenagers and young adults. But obviously, as I've grown and my audience has grown, I realized this is a conversation we need to have, because we have more life under our belt right now. And so sometimes we get comfortable. Sometimes we get complacent. Sometimes we get so fearful of change that we get stuck. So I'm talking to people now. I want to make a community around designing a good life on your terms. You get to decide what's good for you, what makes you happy, what makes you feel fulfilled. I also think success is a big part of our conversation, because many people in my community have reached a level of success, and guess what? They're not any happier.
Yeah.
And so it makes them reconsider, what does make me happy then? Is it reaching the goal I set, or is it the journey that I go on to get to the goal?
Well, I mean, you think about anybody that's listening and the years past where I think, well, if you just had 10,000 followers on Instagram, then you will have made it. But then you get to 10K and you're like, well, if I just have 100K, then obviously my business will be a huge success. And there are people that hit those marks and you go, oh, that felt a bit vapid and shallow. Like, what truly is deep underneath, for me is obviously just making a positive impact in the world, helping to make the journey for one person listening to this podcast today, make their life or how they run their business a little bit simpler. That's all. That's it. It's
But
not
I
about
wonder
everything
what it
else.
took you to get to that. What did it take you to get to that nugget, to know that that's something that would make you happy if you did that?
Well, I mean, honestly, it's linking the work back to mission, back to my core values, making
Right.
sure that the why behind all the initiatives that we do, all the partnerships, the collaborations, every single opportunity that goes across my desk, is it a yes from that kind of a lens. It's not about fame. It's not necessarily about money in the end of the day, because the money comes always. It
Mhm.
always does. It's about linking it back to values and mission.
That's right. See,
Yeah.
that's what I'm going to explore in The Good Life. And that's why the podcast for me in creating We're All Going to Die Anyway was just the beginning of a conversation.
Mm.
If the premise is, okay, guys, we have a finite amount of time in this world,
Yeah.
it just is a reminder to say, am I living on purpose? And
Yeah.
I think I love what you said, that your work is anchored in your values. I think sometimes we think we think we know what our values are.
Yeah.
But I do an exercise with my clients and with my workshop attendees on vision, values, and mission. And
Mm.
it's a simple workshop. I do it every 6 months for myself. It's partly what made me do this pivot to really launch the podcast was,
Yeah.
I just get a check in with myself about, is my big vision matching my values, and is my mission still in alignment with those two things?
Yeah.
And funny enough, most people, when we do this, realize that they've been holding on to values that somebody else gave them or that they think they're supposed to have. But I find when you unlock and you really check into, like, what is it that makes me happy, even if it doesn't make somebody else happy,
Yeah.
boom, then your life is really feeling more in focus.
Right, right. And I can imagine also, if vision, values, and mission are critically important, which I 100% agree, if people are holding on to a vision of their life or their work as it was 6 months ago and going, oh, it's no longer that. Why, I want this back again. Then there has to be some release there as well, right?
Well, we're all going through that right now, right? I
Yeah.
guarantee everybody should be doing a vision, values, and mission statement right now, because the vision of our life and our work is going to change based on how the world is changing.
Yeah.
And so your mission might not change. Your mission might be to, in your example, to simplify people's lives and to be of service and to be of help.
Yep.
But your vision for how to do that might shift right now because of circumstances. So that's why I love this like 3-part exercise, because for me, it just lets me get tuned into where I am now. And
Mm.
our visions as business owners have to evolve and change. I think sometimes the folks that I meet who are most stuck, myself included, have come from when we've had, like our vision board, our dream board. I have like little sticky notes all over my computer I'm looking at right now. Like, those are moments in time that I've captured a vision.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to check in to say, does that still feel good?
Yeah.
Because I believe dreams are fluid and I believe visions are fluid. And they're
Mm.
not necessarily goalposts, they're guideposts
Yeah.
for us to know we're going in the right direction.
Yeah, I agree. 100% agree. So let's talk about facing loss. Whether it comes from COVID-19 or, a loss of a loved one through death or otherwise. Like, what are you doing to cope and process and heal from loss, big and small?
So I think sharing that loss with a trusted partner is really important, whether
Yeah.
that's a spouse, a friend, a therapist, a community group. I believe that when we grieve and suffer in isolation, it's when it can become really compounded. And so for me, I've had a lot of different losses over. What really sparked my interest in talking about end of life, though, specifically, was
Mm.
I had this most incredible experience, Mary, where I became friends with a client.
Mm.
I didn't know her very well. I became friends with a client her last 8 weeks of life on this earth.
Gosh.
As soon as I met her and started working with her, she was diagnosed soon after with terminal cancer, stage 4 liver cancer. She and I didn't know her at all. I never had a meal with her. I never even had a conversation like this with her.
Yeah.
And for some reason, her husband, when she was very ill at home, her husband called me, never met him either, said she wanted to see me. My husband, Felipe, and I got into the car, went over to her house. I mean, think about it. If you're running a business, you never go to your clients' homes typically. It's like
Right.
we transgressed that personal professional line.
Yeah.
And for some reason, she called me into her life.
Wow.
And her name is Myra. I spent 8 weeks with her as she was in hospice, dying with her family. I got to know them incredibly well and love them so much. She died in the beginning of 2018. And the last 2 years of my life have never been the same. Her family has become my family. I'm an aunt to her children. I think about her every single day. She's in my prayers every single day. And the interesting thing was, I never thought you could become friends with somebody as they were dying. And I experienced that. Like, we grew a friendship in a very short period of time at one of the most critical stages of a person's life. That vulnerability and intimacy, it broke me open. It's why I wanted to do this show, because I thought, gosh, I mean, there's so much more than we even think you can get from death and loss. I mean, of course, I would give anything to have her here, but that wasn't my choosing. But my choosing now is, how do I honor the relationship we had together? And I want to tell that story, and I want other people to tell me their stories, so that those that we've lost or losses that we faced become shared. And when they become shared, they don't feel as big or as weighty.
Yeah. And that's where collective healing begins.
Bingo.
So I think, it's really interesting to me, even through the lockdown period, and especially as I get older and older, time is a construct, and time also, time is completely like, wow, another week went by, like, oh, quickly, boom, But I think it's really interesting, as I get older, time seems to go by faster. Maybe it's a compound effect to things. But I think once a person gets a terminal diagnosis or a really big bit of bad news that shifts everything, it does pull you out of being so zoomed in on whatever it is you're obsessing over and thinking is really, really important. But in reality, you're like, it's just non-essential. I think hearing the story with your friend, and I have seen that and experienced in my own life, it starts to help you kind of just take an assessment, like, well, what is most important in my life? What isn't? Do you have some tips and tools there on looking at what's essential and what isn't?
Yes. And actually, I'll conjure up a conversation I had with Myra to share with your listeners, because I had the fortunate opportunity to say to her when she was still lucid and there, knowing that your life has this expiration now put on it that you know of, right? Because we all walk around, believing we've got forever, and sometimes we don't.
Right.
And so I said to her, she had 3 young children, and she was at the top of her game career-wise. She was 44 years old, Mary, when she died. And I said to her, could you tell me what you're thinking about? And she told me 3 things, and I think these 3 things are I would agree, and they've become my 3 things. The first one was, she said, I've spent too much time on toxic people and giving toxic people room in my life, including family. So she was really cycling through who's necessary in her life and who's been toxic that she's been spending too much time with. I mean, imagine thinking you're going to die, and that's your first thought is, I've given too much energy to people who don't love and care for me.
Yeah.
So that was one. The second one was, she missed the simple things like eating a mango. Things that she loved, because when your body, and we all know this, when we get sick, even when we get a cold, we're like, oh my God, I miss breathing through my nose, without all this congestion. She was dying, and because of the chemo, she couldn't taste food the way she loved to, and she loved mangoes. And she said, God, I wished I would have spent more time just savoring the little things that I loved to do.
Yeah.
And then the third thing, which for me and for everybody listening, I know who's an entrepreneur or a business person and a hustler and a climber, Myra was the same way. And this is what she said to me that changed my life. She said, I spent too much time trying to be what everybody thought I should be. And I didn't spend enough time with myself learning about myself.
Yeah.
She said, I had the title, I had the money, I had the this, I had the that, but what I didn't have was me. And she said, and that's my only regret, was that I wished I would have gotten more time to know me. I mean, I'm tearing up now, because I'm like, if we are our greatest project, if we are our greatest business venture, if from giving to us, we can give to others, then that's how I'm choosing to try to spend my time now. And she woke me up to that. I mean, if that's something that she's seeing as she knows death is before her, then all of us who don't know when that time comes, like for me, it was a great inspiration to think about.
It's huge. It's literally everything.
Yes.
And isn't it funny how, especially we as women, chase these other metrics that are frivolous and time and energy wasting. And I know for myself as well is that we're in such like a we're in such a fight with our bodies, our physical bodies, and
No.
all of the actual vehicle that we get to live this life through and with, that if we just dropped it for a second, like
Yeah.
how unstoppable we would actually be.
Well, and the irony too for my friend was that she spent a lot of her life, she told me, because remember, I only knew her for a couple of months. So I
Yeah.
got to know her almost in like reverse, right? I got to meet her in a different space. She struggled with her weight and body image her whole life, not loving her body. And at the end of her life, she couldn't control losing weight in her body because of the illness. So nature has so many ironic twists and turns for us prepared. And I feel like that's why it's another incentive, not just to say, oh, well, forget it, I'm not going to care about my health at all, but to your point, to not prioritize it in a way that feels detrimental to our well-being.
Yeah.
Trying to find harmony with it. Like when she talked about tasting a mango or running with her children or experiencing a sunset, like those are things, if we can have those now in living, breathing, healthy bodies, that for me needs to be enough. That needs to be enough for me to say like I am in this moment, not like what size jeans am I wearing while I'm having this moment.
Totally.
Nobody really cares. Like,
Nobody cares. And, and it's funny, funny and not funny is that a little personal challenge I've given myself over the last month of lockdown is every morning when I wake up, very first thing I do is I look at the mirror and then I go to the bathroom because I'm in my 40s. But I look at the mirror and I have given myself a challenge that every time that first thing in the morning I say something very nice and kind to myself of just look at that beautiful body. Look, check out that girl. And that is just a little thing. And it's not anything massive. And I'm not forcing myself to count calories or whatever hoop that somebody else has created. It's just a little thing. And I think those little things do have a positive compound effect in my life as well.
I do too. I also think just that gentle kindness that you're exhibiting to yourself. I think, most people that I've talked to on the show who've experienced loss have also experienced a period of grace.
Yeah.
I think we get that from loss, right? I think we realize, like you said before, you get woken up to something, right? You get, and that's the gift actually of loss and death, is it wakes you up to this urgency. And that's the kind of urgency I wanted to talk about with people. And that includes the urgency of being kind to yourself every day. I mean, if not you, then who, right? And if we keep waiting for external forces to validate us, we could wait our entire life and never feel as filled up as we could if we really understood ourselves and learned how to love ourselves. And so I think this is for me going to be not just something that gets solved or fixed in our podcast or video series. It's for me an ongoing conversation that I'm even bringing into my work corporately. Loss and change is affecting so many of my business partners right now. They've had to furlough employees. They had to let go of employees. They're losing identity of what their brand stood for. So, I don't discount one person's loss for another. And I think like being able to talk about this more openly is going to serve us all.
Yes. And I keep having to wipe a tear. Like this conversation is making me a bit weepy. But I think it is also really important to give ourselves permission to feel these feelings that are going through us. And I don't think there has ever really been a time in history, at least not in my generation, maybe in the last time that there was a pandemic or the plague, where I feel like the universe has sent us all to our rooms. Like, you're all gone to timeout. You all have to go and think about what you've done and come out of this. And really, truly take this moment to reset and reimagine our lives. So we talk about visions, value, mission, and understanding those elements and reassessing what's essential versus non-essential things to chase after. What else could help us in this reemergence stage, specifically when it comes to the trauma and the grief? Because I do believe that we are going to come together. We're going to be back in rooms together, in-person conferences, like bigger than ever before. But there's going to be a lot of trauma that we as humans are going to have to work through before we can get there again. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think anybody, and we've all experienced trauma, whether we recognize it as such or not. I think
Yeah.
trauma is really important to also seek help professionally for. I think that this is really lighting up for a lot of people some deep, unmet wounds, untended to, experiences and issues in their life that
Yeah.
require that kind of tending, I think, for all of us to look at this differently. But I would say, like, what I think we're going to emerge from this with is hopefully a lot more compassion
Yeah.
for the inequities that we've seen, because if anything, this experience has shown us it's not everybody's not in the same boat. This experience has impacted people proportionately different based on race, socioeconomic status, and other factors. And so I'm hoping that we can remember that we're not as separate as we think we are,
Yeah.
whether it's by country or city or business, but that we are really in a shared experience. And that's what I'm hoping the future begins to look like for us, is more of a collective goodwill towards working together. I think one of the things that I'm happy to step off the hamster wheel from is a constant compare and despair to every other business owner, every other entrepreneur, every other hustler online. Like, I think we were very caught up in our own hype.
Yep. Yeah.
And I think this moment of loss and grief and trauma reminds you that we are all little children living in big bodies. And
Yeah.
so we have to tend to our inner children right now. We have to make them
100%.
feel safe. We have to make them feel protected. We have to remind them that they're part of something bigger
Yeah.
than themselves.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And the inequities of life, isn't it funny, not funny, how the essential workers that we desperately rely on are not being paid an actual living wage. So
Correct.
the next time you go to that grocery store and you see the person restocking the shelves, or the next time you see your bin man come and collect your trash in recycling bins every week, it's just a thought. And I think we need to get beyond just a thought, that this is the time where we all need to rise up and speak. If it means that my groceries are going to cost more next month, so be it. If it means that my taxes are a bit more, so be it. I think we need
Yeah.
to really take action on creating more equity when it comes to living wages.
Well, I think this is an interesting intersection for businesses specifically, right? Because we got to look at our essential workers. And for me, I looked at what is essential in my business and how am I structured appropriately. And I
Yeah.
think also for business owners, I imagine many of us have been re-examining our funds, right? How are we spending money? What are we prioritizing? What is my real service to this industry that I'm in? And how do I kind of double down on that? And look, I, as a business owner, have tried as hard as I could to keep people employed. Luckily in the United States, there was a small business relief fund that was established. I was fortunate enough to get that money. A lot of business owners have not been.
Yeah.
And a lot of business owners, women of color in particular, have not been. Minority and women-owned businesses are at a disadvantage there. And so I think you're right, recognizing that we are not playing on an equal field,
Yeah.
and knowing that you will not lose anything if you work hard to make it okay for somebody else. In fact, we will gain so much more. And going to our depth conversation, perhaps even so much more spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, that for me has a much higher value than a dollar sign.
And as you're saying that, it really kind of sparks to me about a win-win situation. So if you are plugging into community groups or local activist organizations, or just other women business owners in your city or region, you are going to be having that open information sharing of, hey, this thing hasn't come through for me yet, and this is what's
Right.
happening on my side, and start to collaborate and work together. Well, hey, I can help you with this, or we've got aligned audiences. Why don't we come together, pull our
Yes.
resources, and create some new product offering or service out there? That's where that's
Yeah.
the secret. That's the magic.
Well, and that's the innovation that I think will come from this moment. I think once we sort of reconcile our psychological damage from the abrupt stop and the scariness of this, it's a really scary thing. And you're right. I want to acknowledge we've had tremendous death around the world. And by the way, people have been dying, you're right, not just of COVID. I mean, people die every single day. So imagine you experiencing a loss of a loved one that's not from COVID, feeling like, oh my gosh, am I allowed to even mourn this kind of loss right now, right? Because we're focused here, again, loss is loss for everybody. But I think what we're going to get out of this experience will be some innovative and new thinking about what matters, what is essential, how do we want to live a good life, what does that look like for us, and then how can I be in service to others? Because for me, that's my definition of a good life, is always having a lane of service. If I am not in service to something else besides myself, something higher, something different, then that is not for me a life that I want to live. And so I think, having this time to reconcile those thoughts, that's a blessing and that's a gift.
And I can imagine, I mean, the ideas are whirling in my little hamster, my hamster wheel in my brain right now of like small business owners that come together and say, well, wait a second, why do 5 of us have 5 different office spaces? Why don't we share a collective space? And then going one step further, why don't we share collective talent? Your bookkeeper is my bookkeeper is your bookkeeper. Share those resources, and that comes back to olden day Victorian village mentality of very localized in approach. But the beauty is we are global businesses now with technology. Yep. So it's kind of blending the old with the new to create a new reality.
Yeah, I think one of the trends that we're following for our client partners is the idea of localized action going forward from this. Because I think while we are connected globally, we're acutely aware now of how this has impacted our immediate neighborhood and community. And I think we're going to be finding a lot of folks looking to make the world immediately around them physically different and better because of this.
And, side note plug, please, 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 if you're listening to this anywhere in the world, please register to vote. How critically important it is. Every single vote counts, even though it doesn't feel like it. It certainly does. The links are in the show notes to get you registered to vote. No matter what way you vote, I want all people to be heard and counted.
Absolutely.
So, one of the things that I think is really interesting about pivoting really quick is if you had to, as a business owner, pivot at the very beginning of lockdown and however many weeks or months we are now, the pivot still changes. It's not a one-time pivot. You are constantly making small adjustments to align with what your audience, your customers, your consumers are needing right now and in 30 days from now. What are you seeing with your clients of how they're going to refine their pivot and continue to better serve their customers over time?
I think fluidity is the name of the game in pivoting. I think right now we have to get ready to pivot for quite some time to come. So what you can do for that mentally is to prepare to be flexible. So we love to, as business owners, and my clients do this too, they love to get attached to an idea. We had a great creative idea and we saw it and we loved it and we fell in love with it. But sometimes it may not be the right time to let it out in the world. And so I think, not getting too attached to the creativity as a thing, but rather as a process. So getting creative and problem solving, trying something new, being willing to say, oh, wow, like you just said earlier, things are changing on a daily basis. How can we be most fluid? Now, for the large companies that I work with, that's quite difficult. You have a tremendous workforce. You have set systems in place. For smaller businesses, this is where I think we could thrive. This is, I think, your true entrepreneurial spirit can come out and you can say, what is going to be the need? I'll give you an example. I spend a lot of time speaking publicly in addition to consulting for businesses. Well, with everybody doing Zoom this and Zoom that and giving their talent away for free, how will speakers out in the world qualify money for their talent online? When usually you could say, well, I charge a premium because I'm coming to you in Des Moines or in New York City. But now people think, well, you're sitting in your living room, you can just do this and it'll be discounted. So I think, we're going to have industry changes happening where we as creative people are going to have to think, how do we meet an unmet need in this time? And how do I still build my business with a level of expertise that I can continue to charge the wage that I need to charge to build and grow my business. And so I think we're going to have to not rely on old patterns as much and really start to innovate again.
It's so true. And being able to put the unexpected cherry on top of the ice cream sundae, that adds that added value for people. And they go, oh man, I hadn't thought about that. That would be so incredible for this or that or the other. Do you know, I think also is really interesting when it comes to pivot is that, yes, you do need to listen to your customer and what they are saying they need the most. And if a customer says, well, can you just do that every weekend? And you do, and you deliver. And then they go, oh, I don't really want it every weekend. It's sort of like eating, a kale salad. You're like, oh, that was so good. But if you eat kale salad every single day for, I don't know, 8 or 9 weeks, you're going to be like, I really want something different than that. Keep in mind that, and it's okay. It's okay to make that shift and change. And the customer may not always be right in their first inclination after a while.
Agreed. Yeah, I think this is going to be a conversation ongoing for all of us in the business world. I think we're going to need to be checking in with our business partners differently and our clients differently.
Yeah. And lastly, I want to talk about burnout, because I imagine there is some burnout that goes hand in hand with the grief and recovery process. Do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think we're in real great danger of burnout, even though we're all working from home right now. And, for those who've never worked from home before, it's either been a real hard, re-entry, or it's been this glorious period, right, of like, wow, I'm in my pajamas, I'm doing a load of laundry, I'm getting my stuff done. But I was reading a study the other day that says already we're working 3 hours more than a normal work day from working from home because we've got it at our fingertips. And so this is going to require a different sort of discipline, a different sort of value system, and a different sort of routine in order to avoid burnout. And so I think, I would say this. I would say two things to this. I say one is create a structure and then be okay with that structure changing, right? So like now that we've had a couple months under our belt with this sort of safer at home orders, you might be feeling like I am, like, oh, I can structure my day now again. And then you might find in a couple weeks that changes. So again, going back to that flexibility, make a structure, but be prepared to change it. Yeah. The second thing I would say is we still have to let the foot off the gas a bit on feeling like you can compare your ambition or your work product to where it might have been 3 months ago, because we cannot underestimate psychologically what we are also wrestling with in our psyche during this time. Loss and grief isn't always bubbled up to the surface. Sometimes it's in our bones and our body for a long time and we don't know it, but we feel achy or tired. A lot of people are saying, I work from home now. I sit at a computer all day. Why am I so tired? Well, there's psychologically a lot of things weighing on us in the world. So I guess my thing is make a structure, be willing to change it, but most of all, have a lot of grace for yourself right now and for other people. We are all in a new unknown. We do not know what's going to come next.
Yeah, and not all the symptoms are seen physically on the outside. They are internal, that are slowly wearing down. Yes, so true. Grace, I think, is the secret weapon here, if there is anything, and helping you to have that space to get true, deep, restorative rest. I think that comes from giving yourself permission as well. Yeah.
Agreed. Big time.
So if you're intrigued by this conversation, I highly recommend checking out Jess's new podcast. It's called We're All Going to Die Anyways, and it is launching this month. You will find it wherever you're listening to this podcast right now. And also, if you want to get connected to Jess and her team, you can check her out on her website, jessweiner.com. And also, all of your social media links will be in the show notes. But is there one place in particular where you tend to dip in and out of the most?
I'm really loving our community on Instagram for sure, and I'm Jess Weiner on Instagram. But I will want to say that when we launch the show and this work, we are going to start a Good Life community. We are going to start a collective of voices who want to examine what their life means to them. So I would love for people to sign up for that as well on the website, because I'd love to know who you are. Raise your hand. Let me know where you are. And we're going to start this conversation in more localized spaces around the world.
That's brilliant. And you know what? I think I find the most growth and learning from people who are polar opposites to me. And if you can create a safe space for me to have conversations with somebody who is the exact opposite of me, that's where the magic's going to happen.
Bingo. Yes, agreed.
So I've got a few questions. I've run these through you the last time, and I'm going to ask you quick fire this time as well. Tell me, what's one book or blog that you're reading these days that's either inspiring you or poking holes and challenging your belief system?
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, I'm in my mid 40s and I am reading a book right now from Dr. James Hollis called The Middle Passage. So I highly recommend this. If you're heading into your 40s, you're in your 40s or 50s or beyond, he's an incredible Jungian psychologist. His work is blowing my mind. He is talking about the requisite journey that people in middle life go through. And everything you and I started talking around death and loss, this is a lot about loss of identity and a gaining of a new identity. But it talks a lot about our family, our what he calls a first adulthood, which is how we grew up, and our second adulthood, which is who we're choosing to be as middle life people. So I'm inspired by it. I'm heartened by it because I actually feel like some of the things I thought were quote unquote wrong with me are actually not. I'm developmentally right where I need to be. So if you're journeying in your midlife, I would say The Middle Passage by James Hollis is an absolute read.
Okay, I'm adding that to my own wish list right now. Done. Tick. We'll put the link in the show notes also.
Yes.
So tell me, who's one person that you just feel is up to brilliant things? We could shine a spotlight on them, and who knows, maybe one day we'll interview them on the podcast.
I think you would love to meet my friend Karen Wallren. So Karen Wallren, and it's Wallrond. She's in Houston, Texas. I've known her for, over 10 years now. She wrote a beautiful book a long time ago called The Beauty of Different. She's a photographer. She started as a lawyer, then became a photographer. She does a whole bunch of things. She also works with Brene Brown and some corporate coaching in that space. But what I love about Karen is she is getting ready to write a book about where joy meets activism and how you can actually work on changing the world and remaining joyful in your life at the same time. Because I think sometimes people think of that as such a hard and treacherous work, and it is, but she's going to be writing a book about that. I think that's coming out next year. I appreciate how deep she can go in conversations with people on soulful topics like joy and activism. So I highly recommend Karen.
Brilliant. Well, we will link up with her and put her in the show notes so people can check her out also. So my last question for you is this, Jess, and again, congratulations on the podcast. I know it's going to be a huge success, and I know it's going to truly help heal quite a few people and probably yourself along the way. So here's my final question. Someone somewhere is listening to this episode right now, and she is going through a major life shift. Maybe she has lost a loved one. Maybe she's had a health scare herself. But she is realizing that her life is not about her Instagram followers. It's not about her waist size. It's about something so much more profound. What's one thing you could whisper into her ear right now just to encourage her in this moment?
First thing I would say to her is that we see you, like we really, really see you. We understand the pain, the separation, the loss, the fear, but those do not define you. Yeah. Those are not who you are. That's just what you're experiencing. And don't try to push that feeling away. Bring it close to you. Learn from it. Lean into it, dive into it, because you will get out on the other side of it. So don't run from the grief or the fear. Face it, because that is where you will build courage. And we know that you are courageous.
It's time to go through. Yeah.
The only way out is through.
No joke. Thank you so much. Big love to you.
Big love to you as well, Mary. Thank you.